There is a group of about 3 main semi-scholarly people who argue for a Christ myth theory that Jesus never existed. Richard Carrier is the most popular one, and quite frankly, is the only one who is even somewhat listened to by academics. Carrier has a Ph.D. in ancient studies from Columbia University with a specialty in Roman history, though he is currently unemployed, having never held an academic position at any university. His claim is that the existence of Jesus is sufficiently improbable, and his historicity cannot be considered certain, and therefore we are not justified in claiming he existed. Being the most outspoken and well-known advocate of the Christ myth theory, it is important to take a look at what fellow scholars in his field have to say about his position. Here is what some atheist experts have to say about Richard Carrier and the Christ myth theory in general. Raymond Joseph Hoffman is an atheist historian. Hoffman holds graduate degrees in theology from Harvard Divinity School and a Ph.D. in Christian origins from the University of Oxford. He is a former chair of the Committee for the Scientific Examination of Religion. In response to the claim that Jesus never existed, Hoffman said on his blog, "Only in the age of instant misinformation and net attack is this kind of idiocy possible. Only in the atheist universe, where the major premise, religion, is a lie. So the study of religion is a study of lying. Infects everything, is this kind of lunacy possible." The freethought rabble have chosen Richard Carrier as their standard bearer, without any reason to put their trust in his inane conclusions and methods. A man who has never published a significant piece of biblical scholarship, never been peer-reviewed, never been vetted, and never held an academic position. His reputation depends on deflecting his mirror image of himself as a misunderstood, self-construed genius onto a few dozen equally maladroit followers. The endorsement of amateurs by amateurs is becoming a rampant, annoying and distressing problem for biblical scholarship. The disease these buggers spread is ignorance disguised as common sense. They are the single greatest threat, next to fundamentalism, to the calm and considered academic study of religion, touting the scientific method as their mod op while ignoring its application to historical study. While there is some very slight chance that Jesus did not exist, the evidence that he existed is sufficiently and cumulatively strong enough to defeat those doubts. Bart Ehrman, an agnostic atheist, is one of the most respected New Testament scholars of our day. He is currently the James A. Gray Distinguished Professor of Religious Studies at the University of North Carolina, and received his Ph.D. from Princeton Theological Seminary. Ehrman says that the proponents of the Christ myth theory do not define what they mean by myth, and maintains they are really motivated by a desire to denounce religion rather than examine historical evidence. He discusses leading contemporary mythicists by name in his book Did Jesus Exist?, and dismisses their arguments as amateurish, wrong-headed, and outlandish. The whole book outlines all of the historical evidence for Jesus, which tearing down the unscholarly view that Jesus is a myth. He goes on to say at a conference, "This is not an issue for scholars. There is no scholar in any college or university who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, who doubts that Jesus existed. He is abundantly attested in early sources. Early and independent sources indicate that Jesus certainly existed. Paul is an eyewitness to both Jesus' disciple Peter and the brother of Jesus. I'm sorry. Atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because it makes you look foolish to the outside world." In an article he wrote for Huffington Post, Ehrman said, "There are a couple of exceptions, of the hundreds thousands of mythicists, 2 to my knowledge actually have Ph.D. credentials in relevant fields of study. But even taking these into account, there is not a single mythicist who teaches New Testament or early Christianity or even classics at any accredited institution of higher learning in the Western world. And it is no wonder why. These views are so extreme and so unconvincing to 99.99% of the real experts, that anyone holding them is as likely to get a teaching job in an established department of religion, as a 6-day creationist is likely to land on in a bona fide department of biology. Whether we like it or not, Jesus certainly existed. In the Historical Jesus, Lecture Transcript and Course Guidebook, 2000, he says, "One of the most certain facts of history is that Jesus was crucified on orders of the Roman prefect of Judea, Pontius Pilate." But Ehrman and Hoffman are not the only atheist history scholars who think the idea of Jesus never existing is silly. The following is a list of accredited New Testament scholars who are either atheists, lack belief in God, or non-Christians who affirm the existence of Jesus beyond any doubt. They have no invested interest in Christianity, they deny that Jesus is the Son of God, they do not think Jesus was divine in any way, and they deny that Jesus rose from the dead. They are just atheistic or agnostic scholars of the ancient world, who hold academic positions in fields of study relevant to the history of Jesus of Nazareth. Gerd L. Dimon, a German New Testament historian, professor at the University of Göttingen, as a member of the Chair of History and Literature of Early Christianity. He believes Jesus existed but denies the resurrection hypothesis. Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. John Dominic Crossan, an Irish New Testament professor and historian. He teaches Jesus existed but was not the Son of God. That he was crucified is as sure as anything historical can ever be, since both Josephus and Tacitus agree with the Christian accounts on at least that basic fact. Michael Grant, a classicist, 3 history degrees, former vice-chancellor at Queen's University of Belfast and former president of the University of Khartoum. In recent years, no serious scholar has ventured to postulate the non-historicity of Jesus, or at any rate very few, and they have not succeeded in disposing of the much stronger, indeed very abundant, evidence to the contrary. If we apply to the New Testament, as we should, the same sort of criteria, as we should apply to other ancient writings containing historical material, we can no more reject Jesus' existence than we can reject the existence of a mass of pagan personages, whose reality as historical figures is never questioned. Ed Parrish Sanders, a New Testament scholar, former Arts and Sciences Professor of Religion at Duke University, North Carolina. 2 doctorates in theology. One of the most respected New Testament historians. I shall first offer a list of statements about Jesus that meet 2 standards. They are almost beyond dispute, and they belong to the framework of his life, and especially of his public career. A list of everything that we know about Jesus would be appreciably longer. Jesus was born c. 4 BCE near the time of the death of Herod the Great. He spent his childhood and early adult years in Nazareth, a Galilean village. He was baptized by John the Baptist. He called disciples. He taught in the towns, villages and countryside of Galilee. Apparently not the cities. He preached the kingdom of God. About the year 30 he went to Jerusalem for Passover. He created a disturbance in the temple area. He had a final meal with the disciples. He was arrested and interrogated by Jewish authorities, specifically the high priest. He was executed on the orders of the Roman prefect, Pontius Pilate. He goes on to say, historical reconstruction is never absolutely certain, and in the case of Jesus it is sometimes highly uncertain. Despite this, we have a good idea of the main lines of his ministry and his message. We know who he was, what he did, what he taught, and why he died. The dominant view among scholars today seems to be that we can know pretty well what Jesus was out to accomplish, that we can know a lot about what he said, and that those 2 things make sense within the world of first-century Judaism. Gia Vermes, Ph.D. in Theology, Professor of New Testament Studies at Western Theological Seminary, in Holland, Michigan. Former Professor of Jewish Studies at the University of Oxford. Who was Jesus? Did he exist? Was he God? Is he still relevant? To start with, the existence of Jesus is no longer debatable. He was crucified under Pontius Pilate, Roman governor of Judea between AD 26 and 36, and was most probably born shortly before the death of Herod the Great in 4 BC. Quasi-certainty stops here. George Albert Wells, atheist emeritus professor of German at the University of London, once believed Jesus was a myth, and one of the best-known advocates of the Christ myth theory. Well has changed his position to accept the existence of a historical Jesus. In 2003, Wells stated that he now disagrees with Robert M. Price on the information about Jesus being all mythical. Nearly all commentators, who mentioned the matter at all, set aside doubts about Jesus' historicity as ridiculous. He adds, the view that there was no historical Jesus, that his earthly existence is a fiction of earliest Christianity, is today almost universally rejected. Serious students of the New Testament today regard the existence of Jesus as an unassailable fact. Marcus Borg, Ph.D., former Distinguished Professor of Religion and Culture at Oregon State University. He is a Bible scholar and an agnostic, who believes Jesus was a Jewish prophet and teacher. In an interview, Borg is asked, so we have the proposition, Jesus once walked this earth. True or false? Borg responds, true. The reasons for thinking that Jesus was invented by the early Christians are so weak. We have no reason to think that they did. In another interview he stated, though a few books have recently argued that Jesus never existed, the evidence that he did is persuasive to the vast majority of scholars, whether Christian or non-Christian. Some judgments are so probable as to be certain, for example, Jesus really existed, and he really was crucified, just as Julius Caesar really existed, and was assassinated. We can in fact know as much about Jesus as we can about any figure in the ancient world. According to Marcus Borg, the following facts are agreed upon by most New Testament scholars. Jesus was born sometime just before 4 BC. He grew up in Nazareth, a small village in Galilee, as part of the peasant class. Jesus' father was a carpenter and he became one, too, meaning that they had likely lost their agricultural land at some point. Jesus was raised Jewish and he remained deeply Jewish all of his life. His intention was not to create a new religion. Rather, he saw himself as doing something within Judaism. He left Nazareth as an adult, met the prophet John and was baptized by John. During his baptism, Jesus likely experienced some sort of divine vision. Shortly afterwards, Jesus began his public preaching with the message that the world could be transformed into a kingdom of God. He became a noted healer, teacher and prophet. More healing stories are told about Jesus than about any other figure in the Jewish tradition. He was executed by Roman imperial authority. His followers experienced him after his death. It is clear that they had visions of Jesus, as they had known them during his historical life. Edwin Judge. He founded the Ancient History Department at Macquarie University in Australia, for which he is now Emeritus Professor. An ancient historian has no problem seeing the phenomenon of Jesus as an historical one. His many surprising aspects only help anchor him in history. Myth and legend would have created a more predictable figure. The writings that sprang up about Jesus also reveal to us a movement of thought and an experience of life so unusual, that something much more substantial than the imagination is needed to explain it. Graham Clark. He is the Emeritus Professor of Classical Ancient History and Archaeology at Australian National University. Frankly, I know of no ancient historian or biblical historian who would have a twinge of doubt about the existence of a Jesus Christ. We could sit here all day and quote from hundreds upon hundreds of historians, who all tell us the same thing. Jesus really existed,